Hi guys, today's video is going to be a little bit different format. Instead of reading a chapter or two and posting it, I'm going to do slightly like I did Naruto Changes. Or Changes Naruto, sorry. And just read until I get tired. Because I'm so off schedule, but I have a story I'm really excited to do. So I don't want to keep pushing it back. And changing the schedule is so tiring and complicated. So let's get started. Jeff the Killer's Pet by Moonlight Royal, Part 6, Poppy's Point of View. I woke up in a strange room. It was all white with a black bed and a small desk. I walked around the room and suddenly heard crying in the room. I walked to the crying and saw a small baby with black hair and brown eyes. That's me, I thought, startled. I wanted to get even closer when the door flew open. I looked at the door and saw a tall man standing in the doorway. He looked like Sir Offender, but without a hat and a mouth. The person slowly walked over to the baby and lifted her up. "Shh, Poppy, it's all right. Daddy's here," he said to calm her down. My eyes widened from the words he said. My father? But he's dead. I looked confused at the tall man and walked back when suddenly a flash of light hit my eyes. I stood in the forest and looked around. I recognized the forest. It was the forest where I first ran away from that boy. I looked around and then heard something creak. I looked up and saw the tall man standing in front of me again, with the small child. He put the baby down and sighed. My dear Poppy, I had to say goodbye to you, he said sadly. This is for your own safety. I'm sorry. He looked into my little eyes, or so it seemed. The girl fell to the floor and he sighed. He lied down on a tree. After a while, he slowly walked away without looking back. The same flash of light from before came back, but now I woke up crying in Sir Offender's arms. I looked at him and jumped back. He sighed and looked at me with a sad look. I'm sorry, Flower. I should have told you, but I was so confused that I did something really bad. Can you forgive me? He said with teary eyes. I looked at him and slowly sat down with him again. He smiled weakly and I gave him a light hug. He was a bit shocked, but hugged back anyway. My dear Flower, do you know who I really am, or do I have to explain a bit? Offender asked me. I looked down and started to speak. Please do. Offender's point of view. Poppy started to cry softly, and I grabbed her. She woke up slowly and looked at me. When she saw it was me, she jumped back. I sighed and looked at her sympathetically. I'm sorry, Flower. I should have told you, but I was so confused that I did something that really isn't possible. Can you please forgive me? I said with tears in my eyes. She looked at me and slowly started moving back to me. I smiled weakly. After a few seconds, she started to hug me. I was startled, and with doubt, I started to hug her back. My dear Flower, do you know who I really am, or do I have to explain it a bit? I asked her. She looked down and started to speak. Please do. I looked at her and started to explain. Well, my little Flower, let's start from the beginning. She nodded and I started the story. 16 years ago, me and my brother found a girl who was bleeding on the grass in the forest. She had black hair and green eyes. She was crying. Slenderman slowly walked over to her. She jumped up but quickly fell back to the ground. She screamed in pain and grabbed her wrist. She looked at us and didn't know what to do. Slender tried to help her find her way again. This time she lied and just looked at him. He carefully lifted her off the ground and walked to his house. I followed him and did not say a word. We arrived at the house and walked in. Slender went to the doctor and carefully placed her on one of the beds. She had fallen asleep while walking. My brother laughed and wiped away her tears. Slender started looking after her and looked at me. Offender, I need some water when she wakes up. Can you get it? He asked. I nodded and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Slowly, I walked back to the doctor and handed the glass to my brother. Not much later, the girl woke up. She looked at us with a startled look. Slender walked over to her and rubbed her back. She calmed down slowly and looked around the room. She sighed and started to speak slowly. "Who are you, and why am I here?" she asked anxiously. Slender and I looked at each other and sighed. "I am Slenderman. This is my older brother, Offender. You're in my house, child," my brother said softly. "What is your name?" "I'm Madeline. I'm 25 years old," she said nervously. Months passed, and Madeline and my brother became a couple. They were even already married. Slenderland and Madeline were so happy that shocking news came into the world. Madeline was pregnant with a girl. She was shocked by the news and didn't know what to do. Our family had a strict rule about children with humans. We had to kill the mother and leave the child in the woods, or our father would kill us and everyone we knew. Madeline knew about this rule and accepted her death if she could name her daughter. Slender did not want to accept it, but gave up because Madeline stuck to her decision. She gave birth to a beautiful girl after 2 months and was so happy. She smiled at her baby. Her last words that day were, "My dear daughter, I will never forget your sweet face, but I have to say goodbye to you." With sad tears in her eyes, she looked outside and looked back at the girl. "Little one, your name will be as beautiful as the moon, so I call you Poppy." Slender and I looked at her weakly. She nodded at us and gave you to me. I walked out of the room, so you didn't see how your mother would die. You looked at me with your sweet eyes and I sighed. "I promise you, my little flower, I will protect you, even if you hate me," I whispered in your ears. And that's the story, little flower. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I started to hug her and she hugged me back. "I forgive you, Uncle Offender," she said. My heart stopped at those words and I started crying. Then the door was thrown open. Part 7. Slenderman's Point of View. Me and Jeffrey walked into my brother's house. We didn't know where they were, but we had to find them. I had a bad feeling about the situation. I watched Jeffrey look desperately around the house. "How are we going to find her? This house is bigger than yours," Jeffrey said even more desperately. I looked at him and sighed. "Child, we have to split up and go find her," I said quietly. He nodded and started walking in one direction. I did the same, but the other way. I ended up in a large corridor with many doors. I sighed and walked to the first door and opened it. It was a small room with white walls. I looked around the room and saw something that I hadn't seen in years. It was a little brown bear with a bow around its neck. Tears started to roll down my cheeks as I walked towards the bear and picked it up and sighed. "My brother kept her bear," I said in a sad voice. "I hope we can give it to her someday." I put the bear down again and walked out of the room with a smile on my face. After a few hours, I went to a large black door with a rose. I walked towards it when I suddenly heard a girl. "I forgive you, Uncle Offender." My heart stopped for a second. I heard that right. She said Uncle Offender. That means my little girl is in there. My emotions took over and I almost fell to the ground. After a few seconds, I had gathered myself and threw the door open. I saw Offender sitting in the bed, crying with the girl in his arms. She appeared to me before. Offender and the girl looked up, and he let go of the girl. I looked closely at the girl in his arms when I realized who it was. It was Poppy, the girl Jeff had taken. She got up from the bed and walked in my direction. When she stood in front of me, she smiled weakly at me. She hugged me and spoke the same sentence I never expected to hear again. "Hello, Dad." she said nervously. I looked at her and slowly started to cry. My little girl was with me again. I started to hug her back and smiled at her. I'll be with you forever now, my daughter. I'm really sorry I left you, I said, crying. Offender's point of view. Me and Poppy looked up and saw someone standing at the door. It was my brother. I let her go to him, but quickly whispered something in her ear. My little flower, I think it's time for you and your dad to really meet, I said softly. She nodded and slowly started to rise from the bed and headed in his direction. I laughed and looked at her and my brother. They were cuddling and Slenderman was crying. Slender calmed down and started talking to us softly, but I could just hear it. I'll be with you forever now, my daughter. I'm really sorry I left you, he cried, tears rolling down my cheeks, and I laughed that our little girl was back and would never leave us again. Poppy's point of view. I started hugging him even more firmly, standing there for a few minutes. I released him. I looked at him with a big smile. It was strange that I accepted him now, but he is my father, and he had a reason to leave. He smiled back and kissed my forehead. I looked at Offender and nodded. Uncle Offender walked over and gave me a hug. I smiled at him. He whispered something in my ear and went back to bed. Sweetie, walk to the first room in the great hall with the red door and grab a bear that is in that room, he said. I nodded and went back to Slender. He took my hand and went down the hall. I stopped at the door with red coloring. I looked at my father and let go of his hand. I walked into the room and saw a brown bear. I picked it up and laughed. I walked out to the door and looked back at Slender. He walked to the exit when he suddenly stopped. He looked around as if looking for someone. My dear daughter, I have to look for someone, okay? I'll be right back, he said quietly. I nodded and he teleported away. I sat down on the floor and waited for Slender to come back. After a while, he came back with someone with him. It was Master Jeff. I ran over to him and hugged him. He smiled happily at me. Did you miss me that much, Poppy? He said quietly. I missed you too. I laughed and let go, looking straight into his eyes. Let's go, Daddy, I said cheerfully. Jeff looked at us confused and Slender just nodded. I'll explain it to you, Master Jeff. He nodded and took my hand. I looked at him laughing and nodded at my father. He took my other hand and teleported to the mansion. We arrived and walked in when someone pulled me over to him. He was a tall man who had a dotted coat and a high one. And beside him was another tall man with a brown sweater and a white collar with glasses. I looked at him confused but pushed myself away. I ran behind my father and held him tight. He looked at me and laughed as the other tall men looked again. Poppy, this is your other uncles, Splenderman and Tinderman. But you can call them Splendor and Tinder, he said with a smile. I looked at him and slowly emerged. I smiled weakly at the two tall men in front of me. They smiled back, and I slowly walked over to them. Hello, Uncle Splendor and Tinder, I said nervously. Splendor hugged me and looked at me with full eyes. Tinder took my hand and smiled at me. He gave me a chain with a red heart on it. I put it on and smiled at them. Splendor and Tinder took my hand and walked to the couch. We sat down and started talking about what happened when I was gone. After a while, me and my uncles got caught up. It was really nice, but they had to go on again. I waved them off and headed to the kitchen. I arrived in the kitchen and I was thrown on the floor by someone I know. Part 8. Poppy's point of view. Someone threw me on the floor. It was none other than Master Jeff. He lay on top of me and smiled. He kissed my forehead. I turned red and turned my head away. He laughed and stared at me for a few seconds. He got up and lifted me over him. He looked at me and I smiled at him. I laughed as he started to carry me up the stairs. He walked down the hall to find a blue door and opened it. He put me down and I looked around the room. The room had light blue walls and a pink covered bed and a desk. Then I remembered something. It was the same as the room Uncle Offender's had. I laughed and saw my bear on the pillow. I went to the bed and sat down. I picked up the bear and placed it on my lap. Master Jeff looked at me with a smile. "Do you like it?" he asked, and I nodded. "Good to hear, because Offender and Slender did their best to recreate your old room you had at Offender's." I laughed with tears in my eyes. Master Jeff walked over to me and sat down next to me. He picked me up and put me on his lap. He took my chin and turned my head towards him. He kissed my lips and I pushed him away. I turned red and he chuckled. I jumped from his lap and didn't want to look at him. He could only laugh at my reaction. The door opened just as he was about to get up. "Uncle Offender!" I ran over to him and jumped into his arms. He smiled and hugged me. "Miss me, Flower? Now it's only been 3 hours," he asked. I nodded and saw my father standing behind him. I released Offender and walked over to my father. He picked me up and I hugged him. He laughed and tapped my nose. I giggled as Slenderman slid me on the floor. "Are you happy with your room?" asked my father. I nodded happily and gave him and Uncle a big hug. He smiled at me and I smiled back. "Sweetie, I need to ask you and Jeff something," Slender asked. Jeff and I looked at him and nodded. "I have to do something quickly and I need Jeff for that." "Then what should I do, Daddy?" "I found someone to join our family, but I need Jeff's help with that." "May I come?" "I don't think so, sweetie. It can get dangerous. I don't want anything to happen to you," Slender said uncertainly. "Please, Daddy. Master Jeff would protect me." Slender sighed and looked at his brother. Offender nodded to do it, and he winked at me. Slender looked at me and sighed even harder. "Fine," he said, though not too happy about it. I laughed and jumped into the air. Slender looked at me and gave me a weak laugh and left the room with Uncle Offender. Jeff walked in my direction and gave me a hug and quickly followed them. Slenderman's point of view. I walked out of the room and was immediately worried about what will happen now Poppy gets going with us. I really hope Jeff can protect her. I looked at Fender and sighed. Did I really make the right choice, Fender? Something will happen to us because Jeff won't protect her. Fender just laughed and put his hand on my shoulder. Don't worry. I know everything will be fine with her. Jeff protects her. Fender offered. He loves her, you know. I sighed and paused when I heard someone coming. It was Jeff. He came away and we looked at him. Jeff's point of view. I saw Slender and Fender and walked in their direction. They heard me coming and looked in my direction. I looked at Slender with a questioning eye. Why do I have to go? You usually leave alone. And why can Poppy come along? It might be too dangerous for her. First, you have to come because you know this person well. And secondly, you say no to her. I lowered my head. No, I couldn't. I know I couldn't do that. It would break her heart, and I can't do that. No, I said gloomily. Slender looked at me as he laughed softly. And we continued walking. Jeff, we leave in an hour. Make sure you and Poppy are there. I nodded and headed back to my room. Time skip. Poppy's point of view. Me and Master Jeff was waiting for my dad. Master Jeff looked scared, and I walked over to him. He jumped up and looked at me. I hugged him and smiled at him. "Don't worry, everything will be fine." He laughed weakly and nodded. I gave him a kiss on the cheek, and he looked at me wide-eyed, even though he hadn't expected it. I giggled and released him from the hug. After a few minutes, my dad came our way. "Are we ready to leave?" he asked. I took Jeff's hand and Slender's, and he teleported us away. "Here we are," Slender said. We arrived at a small house with a red roof and white walls. The lights in the house were still on, and you heard soft music playing. "Yeah, Poppy, I want you to knock on the door and pretend you're lost," Slender said. I nodded and headed for the house. I heard Jeff growling, but I didn't look back. I arrived at the house and knocked on the door. I forced a few tears in my eyes and started to blink. The door was opened by a young man with brown hair and green eyes. He looked at me with wide eyes. Can you help me? I don't know where I am." I said, scared. He nodded. "Come on in, so you can rest before we go looking," he said calmly. I looked at him and smiled weakly. I walked in and sat on a large green bench. "What's your name?" he asked. "I'm Poppy, sir." "It's nice to meet you. I'm Lou Woods." I jumped up from the name and looked straight into his eyes. "You're Jeff's brother." He looked at me with surprise and said nothing. After a few minutes, he started to speak again. "How do you know my brother's name?" "Oh, I'm his childhood friend when we were little." He looked at me strangely and then tried to quickly change the subject. "Sir, I would like to go home." He nodded and picked up his jacket. We walked out when suddenly he stopped. "What is your address, really?" he asked. "Oh, it's Crystal Street 43. He nodded and walked into the forest. I followed him when we heard a crack. I was startled and ran to Lou. He looked at me and grabbed me in a protective position. Someone came out of the bushes with a white hoodie and black hair. It was Master Jeff. He winked at me and I nodded. He started running towards Lou to take him down when Lou stopped him. He laughed and took Jeff's arm and threw him into a tree. I was startled and tried to breathe calmly. Lou walked over to Jeff and punched him in the stomach. I wanted to run to him, but it couldn't be such a bad pain. I started to cry softly, and my legs started to tremble. Lou looked back my way and sighed. He walked over to me and hugged me. I jumped up and looked into his eyes. "I'm sorry you had to see that, sweetie." I didn't say anything and hugged him back. Jeff slowly came up and looked at our direction with angry eyes. I tried to calm him down by smiling at him, but it was no use. He ran towards Lou again, but was stopped by a black tentacle. I sighed happily and released Lou. "Thanks again." He smiled at me and turned around. I saw my father with Jeff in one of his tentacles. He jumped out and grabbed me again. "Child, I'm sorry about Jeff's behavior. Let me introduce myself. I'm Slenderman, but you can call me Slender." He looked at him confused but didn't let go. His eyes turned red and began to behave differently. "Why are you here?" I was startled and fell to the ground with a loud bang. He yelped in pain. Lou turned and saw me laying on the floor. His eyes slowly turned green again and he lifted me off the ground. "I'm sorry," he said sadly. "I can't control him anymore." I smiled at him and hugged him again. "Child, I want to ask you something." Me and Lou looked at Slender and Lou nodded. "Would you happen to be united with your brother again?" Lou said nothing and was shocked by the question. After a while, he nodded at Slender. Good, because I want you to become one of my proxies. That way, you and Jeffrey can start a band again. A smile grew on Lou's face, and he nodded happily. I hugged him and smiled. I'm so glad you joined, but first you might be able to take care of Master Jeff in your house. He looked at me questioningly, but nodded nonetheless. We all walked towards his house and walked in. Slender put Jeff on the couch. I sat next to him. Lou went to the kitchen to get a bandage and soon returned. He gave the things to me and I started taking care of Jeff. I was done and kissed Jeff on the cheek. He had turned red and I chuckled. I returned the things to Lou and waited for Jeff to wake up. Time skip. Poppy's point of view. It's been 3 days since I took care of Jeff, and he's still not awake. I started to worry. Cinder put his hand on my shoulder and sighed. Don't worry, sweetie. It'll be alright. I smiled and looked at Jeff. Lou hasn't said anything in the past 3 hours. I think he felt guilty about what he did. I got up and sat past him. He looked up and saw that I was sitting next to him. I laughed and hugged him. It wasn't long before he hugged me. He started crying and I rubbed his back. Hey, he'll be fine, don't worry. He looked at me and gave me a weak smile. He was about to say something when he heard a soft growl. I looked up to see Jeff had woken up. I ran to him and hugged him. He laughed and kissed my forehead. Did you miss me, Poppy? Of course, you're my master, I said with a wink. We started to laugh. Jeff tried to get up, but it didn't work. He rolled his eyes angrily. Damn, that hurts, he growled. I shook my head and lifted him up so that he could sit. He looked around the room until he saw Lou. They stared at each other and started smiling. Well, if that isn't my big brother, he said, laughing. I looked at Lou with a smile. So I was right when I asked if Jeff was your brother. He nodded at me with a smile. They talked with each other for about an hour before Slenderman came to us. Well, now that Jeff is awake, we can go, said Slender. We nodded at him. But before we go, Lou, I need your arm. Lou hesitantly gave Slender his arm. I'm going to give you a sign so everyone knows you belong to the family, okay? Lou nodded and Slender gave him a smile. Then a bright light entered the room. I closed my eyes and waited till the light was gone. When the flash went off, I opened my eyes and gave Lou a smile. Welcome to the family, child. Lou looked at his arm and saw a circle with a cross through it. He nodded and smiled at us. I walked over to him and hugged him. Yay! Now a member of the family. He hugged me back and smiled. We let go and looked at each other with a smile. Okay, kids, let's go. I took Lou's hand and started for Slender. Jeff looked at us with angry eyes. I rolled my eyes and grabbed Slender's hand. Let's go, Dad. He nodded and teleported us away. Part 9. Poppy's point of view. Months had passed now, and my father had just left for business. But it wasn't too bad, because a lot of things have happened. Lou and I had become best friends. We had a lot of things in common, and I really liked his drawings. I even thought he was pretty cool at times. He had a split personality called Stool. Stool can be rude, but that didn't bore me. But it's no longer so important. The day that was the day I turned 16, I was so happy and looking forward to it. I enthusiastically put on my favorite green dress that reached my knees and a white cardigan with green and pink striped socks that hit just below my knee, with black flats on top of that. I put on a cute green hair bow. I went down to see that there was already a party going on, but strangely there were no presents, no cards, and no Happy birthday, Poppy! Not all that. I walked over to Master Jeff because he was the only one who was not yet drunk, and tapped his shoulder. Master Jeff, what's going on? It's a party. Does it look like a country with dots? I know it's a party, but what about my stuff, my presents? What are you talking about, Poppy? There are no presents for you, because this is not your party. I didn't even think you were invited. Lou's point of view. I had finished wrapping the present I had for Poppy. It was a cute-looking necklace with a moon on it. I knew she was saving up for it, so I thought it would be a great present for her. The necklace was wrapped in a green paper with a green ribbon and bow, as I knew it was her favorite color. You know, I may or may not be the best at wrapping presents, but I did a pretty good job. I stuck a little card into the ribbon as I walked downstairs to see what looked like Poppy's party at first. What do you mean this isn't my party and I wasn't invited? Do you have any idea what today is, Master Jeff? By my standards, it's a boring day that had nothing special about it until we threw a party. But you're being a party pooper. Out of all the times I have been here, this is the first time you've forgotten how important this day is to me. I knew this wasn't going to end well. I even saw a small tear fall down her cheek. That was when it hit me. Everyone except for me and Poppy had forgotten her birthday. This day was important to her, and they all forgot. You know what? I hate you all. Jeff should have killed me that night. My jaw dropped. So did everyone else's. Poppy started to cry as she ran past me and up the stairs into her room. I heard her lock the door. Now no one makes my friend cry and get away with it. I walked to Caro. Was this punch spiked? No, it's not. Everyone is just acting like morons. Why? Good, because I wanted to do what would make them wish for a hangover. I jumped on top of the table, banging my knees in the process. It didn't hurt, of course. I stood on top of the table. Everyone, shut up! I looked at the other creepypastas around me. Good. I'm going to make them feel so bad. Poppy ran up to her room crying because of my brother. He said that today wasn't special, that she wasn't invited. Ben piped up to me. So, she will get over the fact she wasn't. Plus today isn't special. Some people were more clueless than I thought. They hadn't even taken the hint. That just made my blood boil. My eyes twitched, and for once it wasn't salt, it was my rage. Have you guys had your ears blown? Today is special, and it'll take everything to get her over this. How is today special? Alice Jack asked me. This makes me want to punch them really hard. You guys have known her for the past 6 months. How could you forget? Forget what? Laughing Jack asked. You guys forget that it's Poppy's 16th birthday. That moment I felt like time had stopped. They had realized what they did to the poor girl. I jumped off the table and started running to Poppy's room. I heard Jeff running after me. I knocked on the door, but she didn't open it. Poppy, please, it's Lou. I'm sorry they forgot your birthday. I heard someone coming to the door when she pulled me inside and locked the door again. I heard banging on the door not a moment later. I guess it was Jeff. She didn't even look at the door, and I sat down on the bed. I could see she cried. I walked over to her. She just looked at me, and I started hugging her. Poppy's point of view. I sat on the bed crying on Lou's shoulder. I heard someone thumping on the door. It was Jeff. Poppy, I'm so sorry. If it wasn't for me, they would have thrown you a party. Apology denied. Go away. It'll take more than an I'm sorry to make up for it. I'm not coming out. I heard them walk away and continue the party. Those jerks. They stir partied even after realizing they forgot my birthday. I hugged Lou even harder. After a few minutes, I let go and walked away to change. When I was gone, I sat down on the bed again, and Lou looked at me with a sad smile. Poppy, I got you a present if you still want this. I looked at him and gave him a weak smile. At least you remembered. I could hear you yelling from here. That's why I left you in. That's why I let you in. You're my best friend. It's your special day. I'm really mad at Jeff, though. But here, take this. He took my hand and gently placed a small box into it. I took the little envelope and opened it. It was a nice card with a picture of me and Lou when we first met. I looked at the card and read it aloud. My dear friend Poppy, happy 16th birthday. I hope you have a blast. Lou and Sil. I smiled at how sweet they were. I put the card down and opened the gift. I was so happy with the gift I got. The adorable silver moon necklace I wanted. I hugged Lou and saw him blush a little and chuckled. Me and Lou spent the rest of the night in my room watching movies. Will you forgive me? Poppy's point of view. Hey Lou, hey Lou, hey Lou. Hey Lou, hey Lou, hey Lou. What is it, Poppy? Whoa, relax. I just wanted to wake you up. Oh, I'm sorry. It's fine. Let's go get some food. Oh, hell yeah. I left and walked out of the room with Lou. Not much happened until we got to the living room. Someone was pulling on my sweater. It was Sally. Happy birthday, Poppy. I'm sorry I was a little late. I was asleep. Thanks, Sally. I'm glad you remembered. I smiled and hugged her. Of course, you're my big sister. Oh, me and Daddy brought you a gift. Here. Sally gave me a small gift with a red packaging and a black ribbon. I laughed and took it and opened the present. I looked at the box inside. Tears came to my eyes. There was a picture of me, Father, and my mother. There was also a small turtle plush. I hugged Sally and thanked her. She smiled at me, and I did the same. Lou stood past me and looked at me with a happy face. After a few minutes, Sally had run away, and me and Lou walked to the kitchen. We arrived at the kitchen, and it was empty. I sighed happily and started baking some pancakes for us. We ate it so much that it almost made us sick. Lou and I looked at each other and laughed loudly. But that quickly stopped when someone entered the kitchen. It was Jeff. I jumped up and wanted to run from the kitchen, but was stopped. I struggled and felt the compulsion, but suddenly the person was pushed backwards. It was none other than Slenderman. He was back. I ran to him and hugged him. Congratulations, my dear daughter. Did you have a nice day? I looked at him with sad eyes and shook my head. He looked at me and sighed. What happened, my child? They forgot my birthday, everyone except Lou and Sally. I started to cry softly again. He looked at me and started stroking my back. Shh, it'll be all right. I looked up at him and smiled. He released me and took my hand. He took me to a small room with lots of presents. I looked at him with a confused face and he only laughed. I thought something was wrong, and I told me what happened, so we got you a whole mountain. My face started to light up. I walked over to the presents and didn't know where to start. I was finally finished after 4 hours, and it was starting to get dark outside. I unwrapped the last present. It contained a music box. The music box was a dark green and had nice patterns. I saw a doll in the box, but the doll seemed familiar to me. This is me, but how? I asked an old friend of ours to make it for you. Do you like it? I nodded and ran to him. I was so happy to have him as a father. I smiled at him. Me and Slender brought all the presents to my room. I did not know where to put all, but fortunately, I had my dad to help. My dad and I walked downstairs again. I held his hand because I was afraid of what was to come. Slender saw that I was nervous and smiled at me. We walked on and arrived in the living room. I immediately felt looked at and stood behind my dad. I didn't want to face the others yet. They had forgotten an important day for me, and it was as if it were nothing. I didn't mind that, but they just kept on going without a care. They just kept on partying. They saw me and Slender enter the room, and they immediately jumped up. They looked at me, and I looked away from them. Slender looked up at them with angry eyes. They jumped back and looked away again. They were afraid, and I was quite happy with that. I didn't have to forgive them yet, but there was someone who still looked at me. It was Jeff. He looked at me with sad eyes. I ran away before I could feel guilty. Slender didn't follow. He walked over to the others. I knew that he was going to do, and I walked towards Lou. He was still in the kitchen. I ran after him and hugged him. Thanks for all the presents. But it really wasn't necessary. You're welcome. And they were too few. I wanted to get more, but Slender couldn't afford it. Did you spend that much? Lou nodded. But I have another surprise to the forest in half an hour. I nodded and he walked away. I went upstairs and started getting ready. I put on a dark brown shirt and black pants. I looked at the time and saw that I had 10 minutes left. I decided to do something on my phone. When there was a knock, I looked up at the door. I opened it and immediately went to slam it shut. Jeff was at my door. Why didn't he just leave me alone? Poppy, please listen to me, even if it's just a minute. I looked at him sternly. I didn't know what to do. After a few minutes, I gave him a chance. He smiled at me. I'm really sorry, sweetie. I was an idiot. I broke your trust. I hurt you. I didn't want to. I want to do everything to make it right. Please. I looked at him and I started to feel guilty. Anything you say. He nodded at me. I looked at him directly in the eyes, and I had an idea. I started laughing softly at myself. Okay, but you'll make dinner for 4 months. He didn't know what to say. The only thing he did was stare at me. I began to get impatient and looked at the clock. I only had 2 minutes left. I wanted to leave the room when I was stopped. Fine. I looked at him and smiled. My first order is to let me go. I have somewhere to be. He looked at me and let go. Where are you going, Poppy? I'm going to the forest with Lou. He looked at me and sighed. I looked at him again and then walked away to the forest. End of chapter 10.